And welcome back. We are now going to get ready to add in what are known as triggers into our game. But in order to really demonstrate this, let's go ahead and create another game object that's going to kind of be independent of these. And so I'm going to go ahead and add another 2D object. Let's go ahead and choose this time to create a square. And maybe I want to transform that a little bit. Maybe I want to scale that a little bit in the X. And maybe I want to scale that, or I want to scale it. Maybe let's go in the Y direction this time. Let's go ahead and make that in the Y direction. And then of course you can just move that up. And let's make that a different color so it really stands out. Since I have red in there, I'll go more of a blue. So we have a nice blue object in there. And there we go. We have, of course, that object is now in there. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we got to go ahead and, you see, probably already guessed this, but add a collider to this because we want some way for the game to detect when this player object has collided with this square that's now a rectangle. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in another collider. And again, we're doing a box collider 2D. And if we shut off our sprite renderer for a second, again, you'll see it takes the shape of that box that we had. So I'm going to turn that back on. But what I really want to take a look at, of course, is in the box collider 2D itself. In here, you'll see a little option that says is trigger. And what that's going to do is let this behave as a trigger. So let me just show that real quick before I check that. Just as a recap, if I were to take my little player character here and kind of drive him into, he's going to drive into this, he's going to bump into it, he's going to collide. I'm going to say, oh, I hit something. But again, you'll notice that it doesn't pass through it. So this is fine, but if we wanted to make this a trigger, like maybe this is like when we're picking up something, or maybe, hey, I want to pass over this to go into the next zone, then I'm not going to want it to have this kind of behavior. Instead, what I want to do is hit this is trigger button here. And what that's going to tell Unity is like, hey, this object is now a trigger for some other event, some other process that I want it to do. So now when I go and I drive, I can drive over it. There we go. That looks great. Now, if for some reason, if your player character is showing up below this, so let's say the rectangle is showing up on top. If we look at our player car, you can see we have on here, inside of our sprite renderer, we have an order in layer. So this says its order layer is 0. If I look at the square, we can see it's also 0. So for some reason, if your player character here, your little car, is driving underneath the rectangle, we'll probably want to come in here and change the player car to a higher level. So, for example, if you make this 5 or 10, it's always going to be on top. And we want this to be so that the case so it's always showing up on top. So I'm just going to go ahead and set mine to 5. Even though mine was driving over top, it's just kind of a good practice to kind of get into, just so that way we know that when we drive this guy, he's always going to be functionally over top. And you notice one of the things that's happening now that it's a trigger, that colliding message is no longer happening. Even though they're technically overlapping each other, you notice that our console's no longer printing out the message. And I know it still works because if I bump into the circle here, you can see we got some collision messages there. So to really make that trigger kind of work functionally, we're going to have to add in our collision class here another method. So we already have onCollisionEnter. If you recall though, we weren't getting this debug message to show up, and that's because we are no longer treating this as a collider, but as a trigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start searching for onTrigger. And you can see we get our OnTriggerEnter2D. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click that one, and it will go ahead and populate that message for me. And what I want to do is add in another debug.log, and I want to make this something that would be for that trigger. So maybe it's I passed over something. Or you could have it say something else that you think is more appropriate. But again, you should just have a message in here and make sure that that message is different than your collider message, because you want to know the difference between a collision and the difference between that and a trigger. So now that these are both in here, let's go ahead and save our code, pop back on over to Unity. And if I go ahead and run this now, all right, if we go ahead and drive over this trigger object, boop, you can see I passed over something. All right, awesome. And you'll see that it only happens as long as it's a kind of a fresh encounter here. Every time it goes over, it doesn't necessarily just sit there and keep adding triggers while I'm sitting on top of it or spinning around, because it's only going to happen when it is a fresh pass through. And of course, we can see that our collider is still working there because we get the I hit something message, so that is great. Now, one thing I do want to show you real quick is that we don't have to necessarily have our sprite renderer on in order for the trigger to work. So I'm just going ahead on this square object that we created. Let's go ahead and uncheck the sprite renderer and rerun this. And one thing you're going to notice is we don't actually physically see this in the game, but we can see where it is here. So let's go ahead and drive toward it, and you can see we still get the I pass over something message. And this happens a lot in games where there'll be something invisible where the player will step on it or trigger. Think about anything that if you've ever played any kind of video game where if you're walking along as a player and all of a sudden you have a message that pops up, or you're transitioning to another screen, you don't necessarily have to interact with a physical object in order to trigger that event. And the same thing is happening here. Even though I am not necessarily seeing the trigger, it's still going to work. And this is going to be real important for us as we move forward into the next steps of our game.